Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Beyond Horizons. We're kicking off today's episode by returning the tourists that we took to Tavern 3 in the last episode. There was a layover at Hammerhead station, which you may have noticed is looking a bit busier than usual, but we'll get to that in a bit. And from there they went back to Starport 1, transferred over to the Albatross, which is currently flying them back home now. Yes, the space program is in a bit of dire straits in the old financial department, so we're having to do a few of these tourist missions just to get a bit of money back. And I don't really like doing it because being around Starport 1 is very painstaking because the game runs at, well, 1 frame a second and will have huge lag spikes. And I actually had the game crash on me halfway through this mission, so yeah, I think the save file is starting to bug out a little bit, but hopefully it'll last long enough for us to get all the important things done. And with any luck, some of the unimportant things too, like this little probe that's headed down to Moho. Yes, Echo 2 has a course correction to do to bring its alignment more into Moho's orbit. We have a bit of a problem though, so we don't really have enough fuel to circularize on the first pass, and I think we're going to have to do quite a few passes before we're actually able to get into orbit. I did look into using Eve as maybe a gravity assist to get us, lower towards the sun, but it's just never in a good place when I'm coming round, and our inclination's quite a bit different as well, so we'd have to do 2 pretty big inclination changes to make that work, so maybe in a few orbits time we might be able to pull something like that off, but for now we're just going to be using Moho as our gravity assist, which is pretty pitiful because of its tiny size and its low gravity, and its proximity to the huge colossal gravity well of the sun. So yeah, I'm guessing it's going to be at least 2 or 3 passes if we're lucky, but at least in the meantime we can get lots of good science from all those flybys. The first of which will happen pretty soon and will only last about an hour. That's how quickly we're moving past Moho. Moving on, we take a look at the newest edition of the Hermes launcher. This is Hermes 4, although the next clip it still says Hermes 3 because I forgot to change the decal. And it has a payload that is destined for Hammerhead. We want to take the crew back, and also we have a contract for the science station that needs to go out there. There it is, screaming off the launch pad under a beautiful sunset. Yeah, you may recall a couple of episodes ago that the crew of Omega Base, which were excavating the lunar terrain for the future launch pad, are currently sat on Hammerhead waiting to be returned home, so part of this mission will be dedicated for that purpose. I did think about using maybe a fancy space transfer system like the Nightshade that I tested a couple of episodes ago, but honestly, we are pretty low on funds, so I decided to do it cheaper than that. So we've just gone for a simple capsule with a heat shield and parachutes, very old-fashioned. The rest of this mission is to attach a science module onto the station, just because we had a contract to do it, and it pays fairly well, and also we can configure it with some new experiments and maybe get a little science out of the process. Unfortunately, this mission was plagued with a pretty big blunder, so I thought I'd do it Apollo style. You can see I'm about to detach the capsule there, turn it around and dock it to the science module there, and I quickly realised that I can't control this thing because there's no probe core on it. There's no crew either because all of the seats are designed for the astronauts returning, so these 2 things are just floating helplessly in orbit. So we're going to have to do a quick rescue of that in a bit, but for now let's just return the Hermes 3 launcher. So I actually haven't done a great deal of testing with this new edition of the launcher, and replacing the fairing with a cargo bay has changed its flight characteristics quite substantially. Luckily, I managed to get it fairly on target with the Space Center. I think I would have undershot a little bit. I then realized that actually what I thought were vernier thrusters on the top of the cargo bay were actually RCS thrusters, and since I didn't have any monopropellant, I didn't have any attitude control on the top of the craft, and so I thought it was actually a bit risky trying to land it on the ground, where if I can't point it properly, there's a lot of chance for me to tip the thing over. So I fire my engines and aim for the ocean west of the space center, because I think in the water I have a lot more leeway with how hard I come down. The re-entry itself went pretty much without a hitch, just rotating the vessel as it comes through the atmosphere just to evenly disperse the heat across all of the engines. You can see the overheating indicators do crop up quite a lot there, so just making sure that none of them explode, and we put it down gently in the water without destroying anything. So we'll have to make a few tweaks to this design, but before that we're going to have to quickly race up to orbit and rescue the two modules that are slowly drifting apart. So Jebediah and Kazukaman are quickly rushed into the Hyperion, which is just sitting in a hangar waiting around so that they can quickly fly up to orbit, and one of them will be able to get into the inert command module so that they can actually have some command of it. Yes, we're here taking off in the rain. This is such a time-sensitive mission, we couldn't even wait for good weather. The weather is, of course, provided by BlackRock's volumetric clouds, which it doesn't really actually model real weather, so there's, no penalties for taking off in a thunderstorm, which I think in real life you'd really try and avoid doing, but it certainly looks cool. I suppose the Hyperion is starting to show its age a little bit. It's a bit outdated because we now have the brand new Rapier engines, which have air breathing and closed cycle mode. So we should start working on a more, up-to-date orbital maintenance SSTO. But luckily we just had this one lying around, which suited the time-sensitive nature of this mission. So the real-world equivalent of the Rapier engine is obviously the Sabre engine, the synergetic air-breathing rocket engine, and its development's pretty interesting. It of course starts out in its air-breathing cycle as it's flying through the atmosphere, and it reaches pretty high speeds, I think just under 5 times the speed of sound, and this creates a pretty big problem where the air coming into the engine is super compressed and therefore superheated, and probably hot enough to start melting the components, so they use a helium cooling loop to cool down the air, but then that actually creates the opposite problem where you end up with ice forming in the engine, which also you don't want to have happen because it might start breaking your components. So they had to find a solution for this, and what they ended up going for is injecting methanol into the system, which helped as a de-icer and stopped ice building up in the system, which actually they kept a pretty big secret for a while. I'm not really sure why, but it was guarded by patents, and they didn't want to tell anyone how they were stopping the de-icing process. But anyway, here we are. Kazukaman bravely steps out into the emptiness of space and heads over to the module there. You might have seen I used the camera tools to zoom in and see that I was actually headed towards the right one, because I didn't want to accidentally head to the wrong module using my precious EVA fuel and then get stranded in orbit. That would be pretty catastrophic. Luckily, we got up there in time so that both vessels were still in loading range, and therefore the docking was pretty easy. My main worries was that we were going to get up really late and they would have drifted so far apart that rendezvousing would have actually been a huge pain, but no, luckily everything went pretty smoothly after this point. And there we are, Kazukaman successfully docks the return capsule to the science module and then heads back to the Hyperion. Luckily, the science lab does have a probe core, so the rest of it can be performed autonomously. So we're just going to send up the drive stage and then we'll head over to Hammerhead. But before that, we need to return this space plane back home, which went fairly well. I was a bit worried because you can see my fuel gauge there is pretty low, and I was thinking that if I overshoot, which yeah, you can see I'm already doing, and I always do it, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to fly back, so I started doing my fairly risky maneuvers in the upper atmosphere, flipping the plane upside down and then pulling up as hard as I can, basically to nosedive down, which a seasoned pilot like Jebediah is completely used to, and actually he is the one flying the plane doing this, but Kazukaman probably feeling a bit anxious about all that. But anyway, after all of those thrilling acrobatics in the upper atmosphere, we glide gently back to the runway. I wasn't very well lined up with it, unfortunately, so my landing was pretty dicey, but luckily nothing exploded and everybody gets home safe and sound. So we return back with the Hermes 4, which will now be launching the drive stage for all the components that we're sending to Hammerhead. I have a pretty bad habit of flying something, realizing that it needs to have a few amendments, and then not making those amendments and flying the thing the exact same way a second time, which is basically what I've done here. So I still have those RCS ports on the top, which are supposed to be vernier thrusters, so we didn't really have much attitude control, but actually it ended up not really being a big problem because what I'm trying to launch here is probably, well, actually definitely too heavy for the Hermes launcher. Because it is essentially just a giant fuel tank with a big engine, the Hermes is definitely not the right launch vehicle. I like using it because of its reusability, and I want to be able to perfect the design so that I can land it back at the Space Center every time, and that's just going to take practice and flying it a lot, so the more I use it, the more practice I get doing that, but unfortunately this time I did not get good practice. You can see here we were a bit late with the launch and we almost catch up with the target, but not quite. The Hermes just does not quite have the fuel to catch up. And you might be able to see that the periapsis there is under 2,000 meters below the surface. So we're going to be crashing back down. So I quickly take out the payload, deploy all the antennae and solar panels and get it into a circular orbit and not worry about rendezvousing just yet, because we have about 5 minutes before the Hermes enters the atmosphere and we're going to have to start worrying about it crashing back down. So we can do the rendezvous afterwards, and if we have to wait a bunch of orbits to get that, then that's fine. Luckily, none of that is actually necessary. We end up getting a fairly decent encounter after circularizing this orbit. We'll see that in a second. First, we have to return the Hermes, and this was quite an unfortunate landing, I won't lie. So obviously we're coming nowhere near the Space Center, but I have a smidgen of fuel left, and I was thinking, it is possible to land this thing. We do lose an air brake on the way back down, but all things considered, it was a fairly standard re-entry, and probably even better because we weren't even at orbital speeds. But just as I was coming into land, I was firing up the engines and accidentally pressed Z, which, full throttles the engines, causing the rocket to flip over, and I wasted the rest of my fuel doing that, and I crashed into the surface. A little frustrating because that was definitely landable and I just, biffed it, but oh well, we quickly recover what's left of it and head back to the drive stage here. Luckily, the rendezvous went much better than that landing just there, so as you can see, we got a fairly decent encounter and we just kill off our relative velocity. And then head over, which does cause us to dip back into the atmosphere very briefly, but not really enough to cause any significant problems. I actually ended up trying to overcook the encounter a little bit because I knew that some of the friction from the air resistance will slow us down a little bit, so I was trying to utilize that to fine-tune the rendezvous, and it works pretty well. We get very close to our target, and from there it's just point the crafts at each other and dock them up. Nice and easy, nothing stressful about this bit, and with that we've got everything ready to head over to Hammerhead. I made sure that the drive stage was definitely overkill with the amount of fuel that it had because I wanted it to serve as one of the fuel tanks for the station, because obviously the main purpose of Hammerhead is to refuel crafts heading to and from the moon. So with everything ready, it's time to head over to Hammerhead and get everything set up. So there we are, we've successfully expanded Hammerhead Station, and now it's time to return the astronauts who've been patiently waiting for their ride home. So I didn't actually show it in the cinematic there, but I had a bit of a problem with this docking procedure. So the scientific module there doesn't have any antennae on it at all, so it had to remain docked to the return capsule just so that I could get it fixed to the station, which means it didn't end up on the docking port that I wanted it to be on. I wanted it to be on the docking port opposite the Moonfly because it has large solar panels that need to extend, which it can't do where it is now, so I'm gonna send up an orbital tug so we can rearrange the station at some point. I'll probably do that when I send up the ISRU to go with it, because like I said, this is going to be a refueling station, so I need a processing unit so I can actually produce that fuel, and so yeah, I'll get it all fixed then, but for now, let's just return these tired astronauts back home. It was a nice easy return. That's the benefit of capsules, there's nothing complicated about them, but I had so much fuel I could circularize my orbit and actually pick my landing spot, so I tried to get as close to the space center as possible. And I still had a pretty decent chunk of fuel left afterwards, which I ended up just having to ditch with the rest of the drive stage there, which is a bit of a waste, but on the bright side we got some pretty stunning views of it burning up behind us and leaving pretty trails in the upper atmosphere, so why don't we just take a quick look at that. Again, that Firefly re-entry mod just really raising the bar for the graphics of this game. It just looks absolutely incredible. Anyway, we've got the astronauts back home. They'll be having a nice long holiday, and then they'll be back on the roster for future missions. And that's all I've got for today's episode. I have been trying to get some more Kerbal content made in between writing lab reports and playing Outer Wilds, so hopefully there'll be some more episodes fairly soon. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel, and if you want to catch up with older episodes, you can check out the playlist that this one is in. But I've been Moonfish1001, and I'll see you in the next video.